The neon sign for the Desert Willow Motel flickered with a rhythmic, dying buzz that seemed to vibrate right through the thin glass of my windshield as I pulled into the cracked gravel parking lot. I had been driving for 12 hours straight, my eyes burning from the endless stretch of black asphalt and the hypnotic white lines of the highway. But the moment I stepped out of my car, every muscle in my body seized up with a sudden, unexplainable instinct to get back inside and keep driving. The air was unnaturally still, smelling of dry sage and old grease, and the only sound was the distant hum of the interstate that felt like it belonged to a completely different world. I walked toward the small, wood-paneled office, my boots crunching loudly on the stones, and noticed that the blinds were pulled tightly shut, except for one small, jagged tear in the corner of the fabric. I reached for the door handle, but I stopped dead in my tracks when I saw a pair of eyes staring back at me through that tiny gap, wide and bloodshot, disappearing into the shadows the second I made eye contact. I pushed the door open, a small bell chiming with a sound that felt far too cheerful for the oppressive atmosphere of the room. Behind the counter sat a man who looked like he hadn't slept in a week. His skin a sallow, grayish tone under the harsh buzzing of the overhead fluorescent lights. He didn't ask for my name or my ID. He just slid a heavy brass key across the Formica countertop and told me that room 104 was at the very end of the building, tucked away in the darkest corner of the lot. As I took the key, I noticed his hand was shaking so violently that he had to grip the edge of the desk to steady himself. And he never once looked me in the eye as he whispered that I should make sure the deadbolt was engaged the moment I stepped inside. I walked back to my car, feeling his gaze burning into my back from behind the glass, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't just a guest, but a target that had walked right into a waiting trap. The room itself was a relic of the 70s, with stained orange carpeting and a heavy velvet curtain that smelled of decades of cigarette smoke and neglect. I did exactly what the manager told me, sliding the bolt into place and leaning my back against the door, listening to the absolute silence of the motel exterior. I sat on the edge of the bed, trying to convince myself that I was just exhausted and paranoid. But then the landline phone on the bedside table began to ring with a shrill, mechanical clatter that made me jump nearly out of my skin. I stared at it for a long time, the sound echoing off the bare walls, before I finally picked up the receiver and held it to my ear without saying a word. A man's voice, smooth and chillingly calm, spoke from the other end, claiming to be the manager and telling me there had been a mistake with my check-in paperwork that required me to come back to the office immediately. My blood turned to ice because I could see the office from my window, and the lights in there had just been killed, leaving the entire front of the building draped in a thick, suffocating darkness. I stayed silent, my hand gripping the phone so hard my knuckles turned white, while the voice on the other end became more insistent, dropping the polite tone and demanding that I open the door so we could settle the matter in person. I crept toward the window, pulling the heavy curtain back by a mere fraction of an inch, and my heart stopped when I saw a tall, shadowed figure standing on the walkway directly in front of the office, holding a cordless phone to his ear while staring straight toward my room. He wasn't the manager I had just spoken to. He was someone much larger, wearing a dark utility jacket and leather gloves that caught the faint glint of the moon. I realized then that the real manager was likely no longer in a position to help me, and the man outside was systematically checking the rooms to see which ones were occupied by solo travelers. The voice on the phone suddenly stopped, replaced by a low, guttural chuckle that sent a wave of pure terror down my spine before the line went completely dead. I backed away from the window, my mind racing through every possible exit, but the only door led straight out to the walkway where he was waiting, and the small bathroom window was high up and reinforced with thick, frosted glass. I heard the slow, deliberate sound of footsteps on the concrete outside, heavy boots moving with a terrifying lack of haste, as if he knew I had nowhere left to run. He stopped right outside room 104, and for a long moment, there was nothing but the sound of my own ragged breathing and the wind whistling through the gaps in the door frame. Then, the door handle began to turn, slowly and firmly, the metal groaning under the pressure of someone trying to see if the lock would give way. I stood in the center of the room, clutching a heavy iron lamp I had ripped from the bedside table, watching as the door frame flexed inward against the deadbolt. He didn't knock and he didn't call out again. He just leaned his weight against the wood, testing the strength of the old hinges with a calculated precision that told me he had done this many times before. I knew I couldn't stay in the center of the room like a cornered animal, so I moved into the bathroom, quietly closing the door and clicking the small privacy lock, though I knew it wouldn't hold for more than a second against a determined kick. I climbed onto the toilet tank, reaching for the latch on the small window, my fingers fumbling with the rusted metal as I heard a loud, splintering crack from the main room. He was using a crowbar, wedging it into the door frame and prying the wood away from the bolt with a slow, agonizing screech of metal on metal. I managed to heave the window open, the cool night air hitting my face like a shock of electricity, but the opening was narrow and angled downward toward a steep, rocky embankment behind the motel. The sound of the front door finally giving way was like a gunshot, followed by the heavy thud of the door hitting the interior wall and the slow, rhythmic footsteps entering my living space. I didn't wait to see his face. I scrambled through the narrow opening, my shoulders scraping against the rough frame as I tumbled out into the darkness and slid down the gravel slope. I hit the bottom hard, the air knocked out of my lungs, but I forced myself to crawl into the thick brush of the desert floor, staying as low to the ground as possible. I looked back up toward the motel and saw the silhouette of the man standing in my open bathroom window. His head tilted as he scanned the darkness for any sign of movement. I stayed perfectly still, my heart drumming against the dirt, praying that the shadows of the scrub brush were deep enough to hide me. He stayed there for what felt like hours, a silent predator waiting for his prey to make a mistake, before he finally pulled back and disappeared into the room. I didn't wait for him to come outside. I stayed low and began to move parallel to the highway, my hands bleeding from the sharp rocks but my adrenaline numbing the pain. I eventually reached a service station 2 miles down the road, gasping for air as I begged the attendant to call the police and lock the doors. When the deputies finally arrived at the Desert Willow, they found my room empty and the front door hanging by a single hinge, but the man and the manager were both gone, leaving behind nothing but a pile of zip ties in the office and a landline phone off the hook, still emitting a soft, rhythmic dial tone into the empty night. The sun had dipped below the jagged horizon of the high desert hours ago, leaving me in a darkness so thick it felt like it was pressing against the glass of my old sedan. I had been driving through the heart of Nevada when the engine started making a low, rhythmic thumping sound that vibrated through the steering wheel and up into my teeth. I knew I wasn't going to make it to the next major city, so when the neon sign for the Dusty Spur Motel flickered into view like a dying star, I felt a wave of relief that I would soon come to regret. The motel was a horseshoe-shaped collection of cinderblock rooms surrounding a courtyard of dead weeds and rusted swing sets that creaked in the dry wind. I pulled the car to a stop near the small office, and the engine gave one final violent shudder before falling completely silent, leaving me in a terrifyingly quiet void. The man in the office was tall and lean, with grease-stained overalls and skin that looked like cured leather from years of exposure to the desert sun. He introduced himself as Silas and told me he was both the owner and the only mechanic for 50 miles in any direction. He spoke with a slow, deliberate drawl that felt forced, as if he were trying to hide a frantic energy bubbling just beneath the surface. After I checked in, he offered to take a look at my car in the morning, but as I walked to room 112, I noticed him standing by my vehicle, his hands shoved deep into his pockets, watching me with a gaze that felt far too heavy. I locked my door and leaned against it, listening to the wind howl through the gaps in the window frame, telling myself that Silas was just a lonely man living in a lonely place. The room was freezing, and the air smelled of stale oil and copper, making my skin crawl every time I touched the scratchy wool blanket on the bed. I couldn't sleep because every time I closed my eyes, I heard a metallic clinking sound coming from the parking lot, a sound that didn't belong in the middle of the night. Around 2 in the morning, the curiosity and the fear became too much to bear, so I crept to the window and pulled back the corner of the heavy blackout curtain. In the pale, sickly glow of the single street lamp, I saw Silas. He wasn't just looking at my car. He had the hood up and was systematically removing parts, laying them out on a greasy tarp with the precision of a surgeon. My heart hammered against my ribs as I realized he wasn't fixing my car, he was dismantling it, making it impossible for me to leave even if I managed to get the engine started. I watched in horror as he reached into the engine bay and pulled out the spark plug wires, tossing them into a toolbox before moving toward the tires with a heavy lug wrench. He was trapping me there, stripping away my only means of escape while he thought I was fast asleep and helpless in the room he had assigned me. I backed away from the window, my mind racing through my options. But I knew I couldn't confront him while he was armed with heavy steel tools and I was alone in the middle of nowhere. I looked around the room for anything I could use to defend myself, but the furniture was bolted to the floor and the only heavy object was an old, cast-iron desk lamp. I sat on the floor in the corner of the room, far away from the window, clutching the lamp and listening for the sound of his footsteps approaching my door. The metallic clanking outside stopped abruptly, replaced by a silence so heavy it felt like it was ringing in my ears. Then, I heard the sound of gravel crunching, a slow and methodical walk that was heading straight toward room 112. My breath hitched in my throat as the shadow of a man fell across the bottom of my door, blocking out the sliver of light from the parking lot. I heard the jingle of a master key ring, a sound that told me the deadbolt wasn't going to be enough to keep him out for long. He didn't try the handle right away. Instead, he stood there, and I could hear his heavy, rhythmic breathing through the thin wood of the door. It was the sound of someone who was patient, someone who knew he had all the time in the world because his victim had nowhere left to run. I knew that if he opened that door, I would be caught in a small, enclosed space with a man who was much stronger and more prepared than I was. I looked at the bathroom door and remembered that the back wall of the motel was built against a small service alley used for trash collection. I moved with agonizing slowness, making sure my feet didn't creak on the floorboards, and slipped into the tiny bathroom. The window there was small and high up, but it didn't have the iron bars that the front window had. I heard the key slide into the lock of the main door, the tumblers clicking with a finality that made my blood run cold. As the front door creaked open, I scrambled onto the sink, my hands shaking as I unlatched the small window and pushed it outward. I could hear him walking into the main room, his heavy boots thudding on the carpet as he whispered my name in a voice that was no longer a slow drawl, but a sharp, jagged edge. I squeezed through the narrow opening, the cold air hitting my face as I tumbled out into the dirt and grease of the service alley. I didn't look back. I ran toward the dark silhouette of the desert, keeping the motel building between me and the parking lot where Silas had dismantled my life. I ran until my lungs burned and my legs felt like lead, eventually finding a drainage culvert under the highway where I hid until the first light of dawn. I stayed in that concrete pipe, shivering and watching the road, until I saw a long-haul trucker pull over onto the shoulder to check his load. I sprinted toward him, waving my arms and screaming until he opened the cab door and pulled me inside. As we drove away, I looked back at the dusty spur and saw Silas standing in the middle of the highway, holding a heavy wrench in one hand and watching the truck disappear into the distance. He didn't chase us, and he didn't move. He just stood there like a ghost of the desert, knowing that the next traveler with a broken engine would eventually come rolling into his trap. I sat in the passenger seat of the truck, my hands finally stopping their shaking as the motel became a tiny, insignificant, in the rearview mirror. The neon sign for the Pinecrest Lodge was missing the letter P, so it just flickered a sickly, rhythmic red and a crest against the wet pavement as I pulled into the lot. It was one of those old-school, L-shaped motels where every door faced the dark woods, and the forest felt like it was slowly encroaching on the gravel. I was exhausted from 16 hours of driving through the mountains, and all I wanted was a bed, but the moment I stepped out of the car, the silence of the woods felt heavy and wrong. I walked to the front desk, which was really just a bulletproof glass window set into a concrete wall, and paid a man who never looked up from a small, static-filled television screen. He gave me the key to room 118, the very last room in the row, tucked deep into the corner where the mountain slope began to rise sharply into the pines. I moved my bags into the room, locking the door and sliding the security chain into place immediately, but the feeling of being watched followed me inside like a cold draft. The room was freezing, and the heater made a high-pitched, whining sound that didn't do much to cut through the mountain chill. I sat on the edge of the bed, trying to check my phone for a signal, but the bars were dead, leaving me completely isolated in that dark corner of the property. Around 3 in the morning, a soft, rhythmic thudding started against the exterior wall of my room, right behind the headboard of the bed. It wasn't a branch hitting the building because the sound was too deliberate, too heavy, like someone was leaning their shoulder against the wood and pushing. Then, the knock came. It wasn't a loud, aggressive bang, but a very soft, polite tapping on the door that felt far more terrifying in the dead of night. I froze, my heart hammering against my ribs, and I looked through the tiny peephole into the darkness of the parking lot. A woman was standing there, her hair matted with rain and her clothes torn, looking back at the door with an expression of pure, shivering desperation. She whispered for me to help her, saying her car had broken down and someone was following her. But something about the way she was standing made the hair on my neck rise. She was positioned perfectly so that she was the only thing I could see through the lens, but her eyes weren't looking at the door. They were darting toward the shadows at the edge of the building. I didn't open the door, and I didn't say a word, because as I shifted my weight, the light from the parking lot caught a glint of metal near the corner of the building. 2 men were crouching in the darkness just beyond the reach of the yellow porch light, one holding a heavy tire iron and the other gripping a roll of silver duct tape. They were using the woman as bait, waiting for me to slide that bolt back so they could rush the door before I had a chance to realize what was happening. The woman's voice became more frantic, her pleas turning into a scripted-sounding sob, while the men in the shadows began to creep closer to the door frame, staying low to the ground. I realized that if I stayed silent, they might decide to just break the window, and if I shouted, they would know for sure that I was alone and vulnerable. I grabbed my heavy flashlight and the metal ice bucket from the dresser, making as much noise as I could while dragging a heavy chair in front of the door to act as a barricade. I shouted as loudly as I could that my husband was cleaning his hunting rifle and that he was already calling the sheriff on the landline. The moment I mentioned the police, the woman's face changed from a mask of fear to a cold, hard stare of pure, calculated malice. She stopped crying instantly and took a step back, nodding once toward the shadows where the men were hiding. The heavy thudding against the wall started again, but this time it was violent, as if they were trying to find a weak point in the old wooden structure. I grabbed the landline phone, but the cord had been severed from the outside, leaving me with nothing but a dead, plastic receiver in my hand. I knew I had to make them think I was more dangerous than I actually was, so I started slamming the ice bucket against the door and shouting commands to an imaginary person in the room. I made sure my voice stayed deep and steady, even though my hands were shaking so hard I could barely hold the flashlight. I heard the men whispering outside, their voices low and angry, arguing about whether or not to take the risk of breaking in. The tension in the room was so thick I could taste it, a metallic tang of fear that made my throat feel like it was closing up. I moved to the window and threw the curtains wide, shining my high-intensity flashlight directly into the eyes of the man with the tire iron. The sudden, blinding light startled him, and he stumbled back into the gravel, cursing loudly as he tried to shield his face. I didn't stop. I kept the light pinned on him while I continued to scream that the police were already on their way and that I was armed. The uncertainty of whether I actually had someone else in the room with me was the only thing that saved my life that night. They didn't know if I was bluffing, and they didn't want to find out, especially not with the risk of a siren appearing on the long, winding road to the motel. I heard the sound of an old truck engine roaring to life in the woods behind the building, a rusted-out vehicle that had been hidden in the trees the entire time. The woman and the 2 men scrambled into the cab, the tires spitting gravel as they sped out of the parking lot without their headlights on, disappearing into the blackness of the mountain pass. I didn't move from that spot for hours, keeping the chair jammed against the door and my eyes fixed on the window until the first gray light of dawn began to bleed through the trees. When I finally gathered the courage to leave, I saw that they had carved a small, jagged X into the wood of my door frame, a mark for whoever was coming through next. I drove until I reached a town with a police station, and I never stayed in a motel with outside-facing doors ever again.